effectively, the accent is on unconventional, because maybe my speech of this afternoon will fall out a little bit out of framework of those we heard in the past days. It's about wars. In the greater Middle East, the geographical map is just behind, and I will comment the ongoing wars and maybe the coming one, and try to see how altogether we can prevent this catastrophe. Before starting, I want to thank Mr. Donfried and his splendid team for the accommodation and the attention they gave us right from the arrival up to the departure. And I would also salute the assiduity, as we say in French, of the scholars and the students. I remember my own student life. It was always difficult to keep together during a whole Saturday and a whole Sunday in a closed room. Congratulations. A few weeks before Christmas, a German magazine published its front page under the heading, "The Lost Decade." This look back in language, this morning we said Angst in Germany, inspired many television shows of the final days of December 2009. Indeed, blazes of wars, not lightnings of hope, characterized the first 10 years of the millennium. Irrational decisions, self-inflicted mistakes, and lies left their imprint on the past 10 years, most probably the worst period of mankind since World War II. My humble purpose of today is to analyze the reasons why foreign policy jumped out of the rails and try to attempt drawing lessons for the future. Let me stress right from the inception that the election of Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, would never have been possible in the absence of the fundamental rejection of past errors by the American voters and the deep frustration visible across the world. The Nobel Prize to the American president was not a surprise, at least not for me. It came as a reward and as an encouragement to change. Globalization had just made its way through mountains of war garbage. As tools of my critical flashback to the disasters of the recent past, please allow me to use two opposite notions, conventional and unconventional wisdom. Notions which I borrow from the American economist John Kenneth Galbraith. Professor Galbraith defines conventional wisdom as general knowledge and general interpretation of facts, spread by a big majority of news media. Source of the knowledge might be governmental services or news agencies relying on official sources. The repetition of the same information day after day by various media, newspapers, radios, television channels, and through speeches of government officials up to the heads of state and government creates among the public a feeling of certitude. Truth becomes unquestionable. And after a not too long period of time, almost everybody believes in conventional wisdom and starts to spread it personally during family breakfast, small talk, in offices and in cafes. unconventional wisdom, the opposite argument of the general theory, is pushed to the sidelines. Having generally little impact in the press, the believers in unconventional wisdom have difficulties to voice their concerns. Sometimes they are disqualified as bad patriots or even as traitors. To what extent could conventional wisdom be at the very origin of the most recent conflicts? Even if we lack of a sufficient historical delay, in French I would say recul historique, it might be possible today to disclose what went wrong and what is needed to redress the mistakes of the past and to embark on a more promising path for humanity. Even after the fateful errors to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, and after having considered for too long with a benign neglect the ongoing conflict between Israel, the Palestinians, Lebanon, and Syria, time is ripe for change. Global foreign policy today is a policy of mutual respect. Nations and people around the world should govern themselves according to their own rules, as long as they do not threaten the sovereignty of neighbors or other nations, respect their borders, they must be protected against military interventions. Not every member country of the United Nations will be ruled by democratic standards, but reforms and regime change can only come from within. People, especially young people, have the capacity to react against a stolen election, and bloody crackdowns will shatter at the end the reigning establishment. Should an intervention from outside try to intervene in that process, people would soon rally behind the leaders and the reform movement would be halted. Far from being a new strategy, what I just described is no more, no less, than an appeal in favor of the strict application of a document banning unilateral military actions, the Charter of the United Nations. Thinking forward, what is likely to happen after the full redeployment of the foreign occupation troops? In Afghanistan, an Islamic regime will take over. The Pashtun regime will not lean back on a strong central power. The regional as well as the local satraps, drug and warlords will carve out their territory exactly as they did for hundreds and hundreds of years. In Iraq, the Shiite majority will stick to the political power despite of ongoing, possibly violent disputes with the Sunnite and the Kurdish minorities. A delicate balance of power could finally emerge as the dust of war settles. In Iran, then, intellectual circles, students, merchants will try to reform the system from within, always subject to setbacks and to severe repressions from the clerical establishment. Democratic structures close to ours, to the European ones, human rights, freedom of press, gender equality, and so on, will exist nowhere in the region, most probably for more than a generation. Also, bombings by illuminated fanatics will not cease the day after the last foreign soldier has been flown out. The picture after the wars will resemble the picture before the wars, hundreds of thousands of deaths making the difference, not mentioning the financial costs, $160 billion for the running year for the United States alone, $160 billion. The unwanted Western presence did not change the realities, neither in the Hindu Kush, nor in Mesopotamia, nor around the Shet el-Arab. Looking backward, the administration of former US President George W. Bush is a striking example of the misfits of conventional wisdom. It could always quote it as a school case. The terrorist attack of 10/11/2008 sent a shockwave across America and across the world. Obviously, this strike could not remain unanswered. But the conventional answer, a crusade or a war against terrorism or against the axis of evil, was a wrong one. The spectacular, life-consuming coup, led by a dozen of extremists, was indeed an utterly planned terrorist action. It was not an act of war as propagated without delay by the official propaganda. These unilateral interpretations of fact leads to a series of errors. What was needed was not a preventive war, but a preventive policy, meaning contra-terrorist measures, sharing information by the secret services, and effective protection of airports, transportation means, and communications. Strengthening the security, for instance, improving the international anti-terrorist action by existing bodies like Interpol, could have been accomplished at a considerably lower human and financial cost and with greater operational success. For example, the Nigerian terrorist who attempted to blow up the Amsterdam-Detroit flight on last Christmas Day revealed another systematic failure of the secret services. Not the fact that he spent some time in a Yemen camp is relevant. The man was on the list of suspects. His own father had expressed concerns about his dangerous behavior, and yet he detained a multiple entrance visa for the United States. Strengthening security, not attacking another Arab country such as Yemen or Pakistan with drones and cruise missiles, will tame Islamic terrorism. Constantly moving the military target around the Muslim world can only scatter the nests of anti-Western uproar and create new ones. Instead of a logical reaction, an irrational behavior of George W. Bush and his European followers, some of them deserve their nickname of poodles, lead to military adventures and to a state of emergency, in German Ausnahmezustand, which is lasting until now. Since the 11th September 2001, we were drawn by the Bush administration into a worldwide state of emergency. On the 26th of October 2001, the American president released his Patriot Act, which eclipses the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the international laws against torture, and the conventions of Geneva. In September 2002, the Pentagon, under the leadership of Mr. Rumsfeld, without consulting with the NATO allies, published its new national security strategy, which proclaimed the right of the United States to act alone, to exert the right of auto-defense in preventive action. The 7th of March, Mr. Bush declared that in the need to act, we do not need the permission of anybody. So, by a unilateral presidential decree, the Charter of the United Nations and the NATO Treaty, which is a purely defensive alliance, were thrown into the waste bin, whereas most of the world leaders remained silent. America celebrated arrogantly the comeback of the Clausewitz principle, which says that the war is only the continuation of politics by other means. Lessons drawn by the winners of World War II after more than 4,000 years of bloody confrontation were simply wiped out. Of course, the European Union is co-responsible for this historic blindness. Conventional thinking and the ever-paralyzing rule of unanimity voting in foreign policy matters prevented an outcry against this most regrettable U-turn. Only a few responsible voices, such as Chris Patten, the former British governor for Hong Kong, excellent commissioner for foreign affairs during that time, stood up in a speech to the European Parliament the 12th of March 2003 and said that democracy cannot be exported at the gunpoint. It's worthwhile to be noted. Democracy cannot be exported at gunpoints. And that up to now, said Patton, intergovernmentalism had only produced mediocrity and weakness. A striking example of mediocrity and weakness was the invasion of Iraq. The attack occurred in March 2003 after months of drumbeats and warmongering. Conventional wisdom sent out by leading media forcefully spread two certainties, which, as we know today, happen to be lies. First, that Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein detained weapons of mass destruction, threatening the Western civilization. Second, that the same enemy was linked to Al-Qaeda, the evil network which planned the terrorist attack of September 11. After Afghanistan, suddenly Iraq was projected into the front line as the biggest factory of terrorism of the world. Let me bet that tomorrow it will be Iran. The summit of conventional misleading or political manipulation was British Prime Minister Blair's astonishing announcement that Saddam Hussein had the capacity to launch an attack, allegedly with WMD, on Britain within 45 minutes. A simple phone call to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, located in London, could have taught Mr. Blair that not a single country in the Middle East had any vehicle or missile with a capacity to deliver a weapon of mass destruction or any other weapon to British territory. Fair enough, an inquiry is in process in the UK about Mr. Blair's role during this crucial pre-war period. But unfortunately, at the moment this declaration was made, it was already too late to stop the war machine built up in the Persian Gulf. The military logic had simply swallowed political thinking. After weeks of heavy bombing and shelling, ground forces invaded Iraqi territory, heading to Baghdad. The declared official aim of the war was looking after WMD and toppling Saddam Hussein. These official aims changed as the offensive proceeded, bringing about a regime change and installing a democratic system were added to the official list. Unofficial war aims, such as acquiring control over the oil fields, or last but not least, eliminating a potential enemy of Israel, were pushed aside. They never had a chance to reach the headlines. Conventional wisdom does barely allow dissenting views. Please allow me now to go back in history almost 19 years. We are the 27th February 1991. The first Gulf War, led by George Bush Sr., has come to an end, and Kuwait is free. Decisive arguments not to go to Baghdad, finish the job, and topple Saddam Hussein were put to paper by the main actors of Kuwait's liberation, President George Bush Sr. and his security advisor Ben Scowcroft on one side, and Secretary of State James Baker III on the other side. Their respective books or memoirs, A World Transformed and the Politics of Diplomacy, drew the lessons of the Gulf War and articulated a quite comprehensive manner the conventional wisdom of the last decade of the 20th century. The theory written down by Bush, father, and his Secretary of State was a theory of non-intervention in foreign countries' internal affairs. I quote, "Trying to eliminate Saddam," writes George Bush, the father, extending the ground war into an occupation of Iraq would have violated our guideline and would have incurred incalculable human and political costs. We would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and, in effect, rule Iraq. And finally, he writes, "Had we gone to the invasion route, the United States could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly hostile land. It would have been a dramatically different and perhaps barren outcome." End of quote. In even clearer terms, Secretary of State James Baker confesses that ending the war just after the liberation of Kuwait was a quite controversial issue in the United States. He qualifies as nonsense the insistence of the hardliners to continue the offensive all the way to Baghdad. It would have been ridiculous from a practical standpoint. I quote, "More to the point, Iraqi soldiers and civilians could be expected to resist an enemy seizure of their country with a ferocity not previously demonstrated on the battlefields of Kuwait. Even if Saddam were captured and his regime toppled, American forces would still be confronted with the specter of a military occupation with indefinite duration to pacify the country and sustain a new government in power. The entering urban warfare would merely result in more casualties of American GIs than the war itself, thus creating a political firestorm at home, criticism from many of our allies, and the dissolution of the coalition." End of quote. What I just read, briefly, I consider it personally as a masterpiece of political diplomacy. But apparently George W. Bush did not read his father's book. Right in 91, wrong in 2002 or 2003, question mark. The lessons why the invasions of Afghanistan and of Iraq never should have happened was swept under the carpet. No wonder that today the specter of occupation is haunting the American people as well as the people of those who followed suit. An unpopular war cannot be won. On the contrary, it will be lost, not necessarily on the battlefield, as this was the case in Vietnam, but in front of the television screens of the ordinary people at home. Significantly, contrary to some of its political leaders, European public opinion was and still is opposed to the military adventure launched by the former American president. This is confirmed by older and more recent polls. One remarkable example, a survey conducted by the non-suspect German Marshall Fund in September 2007 found out that 77% of European citizens disapproved the American president. Same in the United States. A poll realized in November 2009, very recent one, by the CNN Research Corporation, soon after the search decided by President Obama, showed that the Afghan war remains unpopular. A majority of 55% of the Americans oppose the war. 1/4 of the samples favored the war as it began, but oppose it now. They have changed mind. A very significant poll was initiated in November 2003, just after the start of the war, by Eurobarometer. Eurobarometer in English, Eurobarometer, French, a polling institute financed by the European Commission. A representative number of citizens of the EU member states were asked to pick out of dozens of countries those they consider to be the most dangerous for world peace. Emerging at the first ranks of the poll were Israel and the United States. The uproar was great among the winners, and the Commission's President Romano Prodi felt compelled to apologize. The apologies may have been politically correct, but not necessarily indispensable. But after all, this was Bush's America and Sharon's Israel. One might be curious how the result would be today, but let us guess that this disturbing question will never be repeated again in the European Union. It was, in fact, repeated in Turkey, an American ally for 60 years, 3 years later in 2006, where in a poll, 74% of the respondents said they saw America as the biggest threat to world peace. Now, let me come back to basics. The conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors is a catalyst of all the wars in the greater Middle East. It has to be solved, I would say trenched, as a Gordian knot in order to bring peace to the region and start the process of reconciliation between the West and the Muslim world. All the conflicts, from Pakistan to Israel, from Iran to Yemen, are inextricably and globally linked. They cry for a global solution. Decades of double standards, the never-increasing repression of the Palestinian people, massacres of civilians during the ongoing military offensive, Sabra, Shatila, Canaan, Lebanon, Jenin, Gaza, have swollen the tide of humiliation in the whole Arab world. The degree of hatred against the West and against the symbols of the West probably never has been greater since the Crusades of the 11th century. In his Cairo speech to Arab countries in June 2009, President Obama clearly recognized the reality that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in the center of all the conflicts of the Middle East. He stressed that the basis of a solution is a recognition of the borders of 1967. Obama addressed an appeal to all, including Hamas, to negotiate a lasting peace. Almost 7 months have passed, and not the slightest movement can be perceived. The road to peace is blocked by 40 years of bloodshed and of occupation, mountains of paper scraps, violations of signed commitments. During the history of the Israeli-Arab conflict, writes the publisher of the newspaper, Israeli newspaper, Yediot Aharonot, not a single agreement has been implemented. The publication killed the implementation. Time has come to scrutinize the profound reasons of these repetitive failures pointed by the Oslo agreements, the Madrid conference imposed by George Bush Sr. after the First Gulf War, the Taiba peace talks, the Camp David Accord, the road map of the quartet, and I forget other roads and other maps. As soon as issued, the good intentions were torpedoed by spirals of violence triggered either by suicide attacks of Palestinian extremists or by Israeli military raids against Palestinian towns, 2 intifadas, and 4 calamitous wars launched by Israel into Lebanon and into Gaza. To understand the reason of the present deadlock and the very end of bilateral contracts, I need not mention the closure of territories, the extrajudicial killings, the roadblocks, the construction of the apartheid wall biting deep into the West Bank, and last but not least, the never-ending building of settlements and the cancerous land grasp. The underlying strategy behind all this is to kill the exile of a viable Palestinian state. In the meantime, the spiral of death turned at an increasing speed. A masterpiece of counterproductive reactionism was the murder of Sheikh Yassin, a paraplegic old man nailed on his wheelchair. Yassin was the spiritual guide of Hamas. The death sentence ordered by Sharon was carried out the 22nd of March 2004 by an Israeli attack helicopter, regardless of collateral damages. Hamas' influence among the Palestinian population grew ever since, and consequently it won the elections in January 2006. Trying to interpret these stubborn facts and to find Ariana's Gern out of the labyrinth, I must again revert to conversional and unconventional thinking. According to conventional thinking, the State of Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. This tiny country, a Western outpost, almost our cousins, in a hostile environment, is surrounded by enemies, superior in number, some of them being ready to wipe it out of the map. This myth, solid as a rock, is firmly anchored in the minds of a majority of Americans and Europeans. It is fitting to such a self-portrait that security with a capital S is the essential, if not the unique, point of policy. The right to defend itself enjoys the absolute top of priorities. It can never be questioned, neither at home nor abroad. All other principles, such as respect of international and humanitarian law, the respect of the resolutions of the UN Security Council, the respect of the decisions of the International Court of Justice, are ruled out as irrelevant. Priority to security includes the right of first strike, banned by the UN Charter, the use of disproportional force and forbidden weapons, collective punishments, the recourse to human shields, the destruction of civil infrastructures such as schools, hospitals, roads, water and sewage facilities, chicken farms, as done in Lebanon, greenhouses, UN offices, as done in Gaza, olive trees, and of course, private houses, inhabited or not. Whatever the military define as a target is a military target. Every person killed is an enemy combatant. Body counts may be allowed or may not be allowed at a later stage. Civilians, women, children killed, injured, or deeply traumatized by the death of a loved one or the destruction of their habitation are, in military terms, collateral damages. The victims have no right to appeal, no right of compensation. The occupation forces enjoy total impunity. Critical statements against this kind of warfare, like the Goldstone report on the latest offensive again in Gaza, are dismissed as biased long before publication in the press and wiped off the table. How can anyone dare to charge with war crimes or crimes against humanity the most moral army of the world? Causa finita. The report of the Judge Goldstone, committed by the United Nations Secretary himself, was approved by a significant majority to the General Assembly of the General Assembly of the United Nations. But the Israeli government knows how to elude its implementation in bypassing UN resolutions. It can lean back on a long experience. The crux of Israel is that it is the only country in the world which does not recognize its own borders, those borders which have been internationally agreed. Its school children are given national maps showing the country within biblical borders which existed 2,000 years ago before the invasions of the Romans, the promised land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Included inside this map are the illegally annexed territories, East Jerusalem and the Syrian Golan. Today, more than 500,000 Jewish settlers occupy roughly 1/3 of the West Bank, the rest of this territory being cut into pieces, military territory on one side, the Palestinian Bantustans at the other. To make the two-state solution merely impossible, Israel's constitution leaves to a national referendum any retrocession of illegally annexed territories. This raises, at least for me, a question of logic and of double standards. Can we, Europeans, urge Hamas to recognize Israel as long as Israel does not recognize itself? Hard to imagine how negotiations with the entrenched, handcuffed, and partly imprisoned Arab enemy could lead out of this deep, self-built bunker. Anyway, the method of negotiations followed up to now has completely failed. Direct negotiations between parties is a worn-out paradigm, writes the former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami very recently, and I quote, "When left to their own devices, they are bound to come to a deadlock," end of quote. In order to complete the picture, other unconventional positions inside Israel and inside the United States should not be ignored. The peace camp has a weak voice, but it is not entirely silent. The minority views expressed time and again in the newspapers Haaretz and in the International Herald Tribune are courageous deviations from the official line. For instance, Avram Bush, former president of the Knesset, Uri Avarni, a critical journalist, Jonathan Pellet, survivor of the Holocaust, and Ilan Pappé, historian, who wrote a book about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and many other personalities and NGOs throw their counterweight into the uneven balance. A very important document for a just peace, which could serve as a reference during the final peace negotiations is the Geneva Initiative. It was signed the 11th December 2003 in Geneva by the Israeli Yossi Beilin, former Minister of Justice, and the Palestinian MP Abdel Rabo, member of the Fatah. This shining piece of forward thinking in an environment of death tackles and settles not only the problem of the borders, but also the problem of Jerusalem and the right of return of the Palestinian refugees recognized by the UN. As a significant curiosity, I would like to mention the hardliner Ehud Olmert's political testament, immediately disqualified as poisonous gift by an Israeli all-party consensus. I quote, "We have to pull out," writes Olmert, "of almost all the territories, including the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, including the Golan Heights," end of quote. Certainly, this amazing confession of a prime minister on leave was in the news, but not a single leader of a Western country paid him attention or gave him applause. The day after, the Israeli press was covered again by headlines on terrorism, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Ahmadinejad. As suggested by Michel Rocard, former French Prime Minister, I quote, "Israel had a surplus of sympathy due to the Shoah. It could do what nobody else could do. This is over now. Israel has to admit that it belongs to the international community and that it must abide by its rules." End of quote. It would bring European policy a great step forward, I must stress this, here in Berlin, if Chancellor Merkel came to the same conclusions as Michel Rocard. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been involved in the Middle East conflict in my capacity as foreign minister and as president of the Council in 1985, 1991, and 1997. Today, I remain an independent, critical observer of the facts on the ground and on the news they generate on either side. Please allow me, therefore, to declare, and I weigh my words, that all the leaders succeeding the government of Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister assassinated by the Israeli hawk Yigal Amir in 1995, just tried to stick to the status quo. Sticking to the status quo means consolidating the territorial conquest and annexations and expanding the colonization. They pay peace a lip service, but remain fundamentally unwilling to make the slightest territorial concession, unwilling to dismantle a single settlement in the West Bank, unwilling to return to the borders of 1967. Every observer of average intelligence, except those, of course, who adhere to extremist views, should have understood, at least by 2010, peace in the Middle East means no less, no more than the end of the occupation. And opposite, continuing the occupation means endless war. Time for action is now, and it's also time to get tough. President Obama, having successfully accomplished his domestic job, the healthcare reform, hopefully, I must add, after the Massachusetts election, has his hands free to dismantle the mountain of mistrust in the Middle East, guided as he is by a global long-term approach. With no breakthrough in the Arab-Israeli conflict, insists Minister Ben-Ami, former Israeli foreign minister, Obama is left with the epicenter of the Middle East maladies seriously undermining his entire strategy in the region. The Cairo speech draws the outlines of a global solution. President Obama and his advisors must be conscious by now that the acting right-wing Netanyahu-Lieberman government will not move an inch towards a just and lasting peace. Without giving lessons, let me just try to imagine and share with you how the American president could proceed. An international peace conference should be convened at short notice in a symbolic Mediterranean town. Why not in Istanbul, cultural capital of 2010? Invited should be all the parties involved into the conflict, without exception, explicitly the Fatah and Hamas, Israel and its neighbors, the United Nations, the European Union, and Russia. I open a bracket. How to justify the ban on Hamas while in Afghanistan a dialogue with the Taliban is now part of the new exit strategy. Close the bracket. Every party invited to the peace conference will immediately accept. Israel will loudly object, but most probably will finally be present, exactly as this was the case in Madrid, a conference convened by President Bush Sr. after the first Gulf War. Israel will, of course, weigh the consequences of an agreement in absentia. Can President Obama do that? Yes, he can. The timing for a peace conference is most urgent because a de facto ceasefire is in place between Israel, the Fatah, and Hamas, a precondition which is still lacking in Afghanistan between the Allied forces and the Taliban. An effective ceasefire is in place. This is a good condition to start talks. The agenda of the International Peace Conference, the conference of last chance, is to be set up by the host. Drawing lessons from the past, it should by no means embark to another interim solution or transitory agreement. It should, on the contrary, draw straight away the outline of the final stage and set a strict and binding timetable for the redeployment of the Israeli occupation forces and of the settlers, as well for the dismantling of the apartheid wall as ordered by the International Court of Justice. The new map of the Middle East will have, or must have, two focal points. On one side, Israel, with its secured borders of 1967, corrections of the borders remaining possible through mutually agreed land swaps according to the international rule 1-to-1 or 10-to-10. On the other side, the Palestinian state with sovereignty over the entire West Bank and Gaza and its airspace, the problem of Jerusalem and the problem of the refugees being resolved according to the Geneva Initiative. The Palestinian state would be recognized without delay by the United Nations and would, of course, enjoy the protection of every sovereign nation. The return to legality and to normality could, if necessary, be accompanied by financial and military aid from the participants to the conference. And as a parallel move, the Arab countries should officially recognize Israel as they pledged to do during their Beirut summit in March 2002. Not to be naive, I must confess that this big land for peace deal will not be easy. It will be obstructed by the infuriated, radicalized settlers, by the way, heavily armed on one side, and the military establishment on the other side. In peacetime, the political military complex, to take an expression of late President Eisenhower, the political military complex will lose its pivotal dominant position it holds in the society, this since the creation of Israel. But I believe that the Americans have ways and means to remove the stumbling blocks these two interest groups will throw on the road of peace. Mutual recognition and reconciliation will have unexpected economic benefits. Goods and services, and gradually people, all but weapons, could circulate freely in the entire region which since the ancient times is known for the intellectual skill, the commercial spirit, and the compelling initiative of all its inhabitants, whatever the borders are. Especially Israel would not be harmed by the transition from an economy of war to an economy of peace, and most importantly, it would be fully integrated into the Euro-Mediterranean European economic space. Finally, the problem of Iran should be addressed separately, but in parallel to the International Peace Conference, also on the basis of the stretch tent of President Obama. Be it right or wrong, the political power in Iran rests with the Ayatollah regime, whose political arm, or you may call it puppet, today is Ahmadinejad. Waiting for a regime change is not an option. The necessary political contacts have to be initiated now. A hardening of the Western positions would dry out the green shoots of political evolution in Iran, visible in Iran, whereas a normalization of our relations would favor these green shoots. Ladies and gentlemen, after Iran had kept a neutral stand during the first Gulf War, the European Troika, foreign ministers at that time, composed by Luxembourg, Italy, and the Netherlands, paid a visit to Tehran in spring 91. Acting president was Ayatollah Rafsanjani and foreign minister Ali Akbar Velayati. After a few hours of critical dialogue, it became obvious to the European ministers that this important country, in terms of population and in terms of landmass, was impatient to recover its position as regional power it always held in the Persian Gulf, throughout the Shah regime, and in the Middle East. It complained severely about the sanctions imposed on it by the late Carter administration, and it affirmed again and again its peaceful intentions. At the difference of Israel and the United States, stressed the foreign minister, Iran never in its history invaded any country. It was perfectly clear to me the Persians, like the Greeks, like the Turks, to remain on the same, practically on the same regional parallel, are proud nations, conscious of their historical background and on their rich cultural heritage. Neither of these countries would kneel down under threat. 19 years later, apart the name of the president, the same parameters stay in place around the Persian Gulf. The only substantial change is a nuclear dispute. According to the conventional wisdom spread on the media, in front pages even today in the Berlin Tagesblätter, Iran is secretly building a nuclear military capacity, threatening the whole region, if not the whole world. Panic-like reactions regularly appear in the Israeli press, where Ahmadinejad is portrayed as a new Hitler or Israel's Ben Laden. Appeals advocating a preventive strike are frequent. It is 1938 and Iran is Germany, Mr. Netanyahu stressed already in 2006. A threefold mystification. We are not in 38. Iran is not Germany, and we are not in Munich. The explosive capacity of this verbal escalation should not be ignored by any world leader. On the other hand, the IAEA, based in Vienna, the Atomic Supervisory Agency, has so far not confirmed that Iran is likely to proceed with the fabrication of nuclear fuel able to be used as a weapon. Also, it complains about restricted access to the uranium enrichment facilities. As underlined in a special report on Iran dated 2006, published by the British newspaper The Economist, it will be several years before the country has enough of the stuff to power a reactor, and between 5 and 10, in the opinion of the American Director of National Intelligence, before it could make a bomb. Clearly, Iran is some way from being a nuclear country, end of quote, of the American report. So sufficient time is left for diplomacy. Personally, I consider, even if I am conscious as this view might not be shared by everybody here present, that floating incertitude about Iran's nuclear intentions is a deliberate strategy of the Ayatollah regime. Its intentions is to focus on Iran the attention of the rest of the world, who would even take notice of the sanctions imposed to Iran during the 1980s and strengthened since if it did not play with nuclear fears. Similarly, who would care about poverty-stricken North Korea, also hit by long-lasting sanctions since the War of the Two Koreas, if it did not wave the nuclear flag? We are here at the interconnection of three disciplines: economy, the sanctions; politics, the increasing pressure; and psychology. I behave abnormally until somebody cares about me. In such a situation, it seems obvious that adding more sanctions will be useless. On the contrary, this strategy could trigger an escalation leading straightly to a military intervention. Fortunately, an alternative exists. I will call it to mind in a moment. Anyhow, Iranians, like anyone else, any other nation, do not ignore that there is no successful use of nuclear capacities, as said Robert McNamara, former American Defense Secretary, and that collective suicide is not a rational option, said François Mitterrand. A military attack or preventive strike using conventional weapons launched possibly by Israel against Iran would not immediately initiate a collective suicide, but most certainly would trigger a massive retaliation, and an economic disaster. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, see behind on the map, for oil shipping would send the oil price through the roof of Dubai's highest tower. And Dubai is west of the Hormuz Strait. This would mean a death blow to world economic recovery. Exactly for this reason, the chief editor of Die Wirtschaftswoche opines that reasonable forces will prevent this little attack from happening. He quite rightly stresses the invisible indisciplinarity between policy and economy. But how prevent an ignition by unreasonable forces in the name of the all-embracing security? At this point of the story appears in the limelight Barack Obama's pledge for a nuclear-free world. While it is understood that the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which detain thousands, more than thousands, of nuclear warheads, have to do their home job, why not start by putting an end to any nuclear tentation in the most dangerous, the most explosive region in the world? Why not start right now a serious round for a nuclear-free Middle East? Let me recall that Iran has signed a non-proliferation treaty, whether Israel has not signed this. Concerning sanctions, the double standard glares again in fluorescent red color. Supposing that Israel possesses 200 nuclear warheads, Obama's insisting demand appears obvious. Iran should accept a strict control of the AEAR, of its civil enrichment facilities, and also Israel should dismantle its existing military nuclear capacities under IAEA control. As an alternative, one could imagine that Israel's capacities are locked in with an American key. In a peaceful environment of a state of Israel, recognized by its Arab neighbors, and an Iran reintegrated into the regional economy, and a worldwide nuclear disarmament-making progress, the ambition to possess a nuclear bomb will recede. Mutual independence would make nuclear armament an unaffordable temptation. To sum up, concerning Iran, President Obama holds 2 powerful tokens in his hands: the process of normalization and the process of denuclearization. No Iranian leader or cleric would resist such an offer for too long. As I am approaching the end of my lecture on global foreign policy today, an unconventional approach, and so I have not consciously crossed the white line of international law, I have to apologize. First, to those among the audience who found my approach maybe subjective because too much colored by personal souvenirs. Second, to those who noticed, quite rightly, that my reflections constitute a non-conservative, non-American, and of course non-authorized interpretation of President Obama's promise of change. And finally, to the entire audience for having delivered, with a few weeks of delay, a kind of Christmas dream. Thank you.